Thank you, Madam Chair. Just wanted to welcome Dan Roach. We have, as you can see, we do have a new person at the table. I introduced you all to Mr. Roach via email, but it's great to have him with us. He fills the seat that Ed Giobbe occupied, and we certainly and we plan to do this at a subsequent meeting to recognize Ed's service. His invaluable service to the commission, and we will recognize that at the probably we're looking to do that at the April meeting. But certainly want to welcome Dan. Dan currently lives in Georgetown County in Devedue, but he is a born and bred in Columbia. He graduated from USC. And began his career as a financial advisor with Robinson Humphrey in Columbia. And after 40 years of multiple mergers, he retired as the Director of Wealth Management with Morgan Stanley in 2020. Dan also serves on the board of Brookgreen Gardens for the last 16 years. I've had an opportunity to spend a good bit of time with Dan since he's been appointed. I can tell you he's a fantastic person. I am very much looking forward to what he will bring to the commission, his experience, and his just overall fantastic attitude. I think he's going to make a valuable commission member, and we're lucky to have him.
So he's a Tiger fan, or?
You're not allowed to say that.
What's your attitude?
Yeah, you can't say.
I'm not a Tiger fan.
When you're with the side of Williams Bryce, you can't. It's like it will. I can still see it. It's like in the shadow. I can still see it. That's right. So, but welcome. And also one other reminder before we get started. To fill out your statements of economic interest and file those by March 30th. So for the year 2024, I believe.
Have you sent? They've been sent on email, Lois?
We'll send you a reminder and a link to but you have to go onto the State Ethics Commission website.
Yeah, we got it. I think we got one email anyway. That's when I started mine.
Right. Okay. Usually like the fifth email, I do mine.
Yeah.
So, by the fifth email.
Any other announcements?
Yeah, I just want to say that I have a guest, Ross, who's sitting over here. He's a graduate student at USC, and he's interested in doing his master's thesis on the work of the commission.
Oh,
wow.
Here too.
Very good.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
All right.
Okay.
Welcome.
Any other announcements? In that case, I'm going to call to order the February 13th, 2025 meeting of the South Carolina Retirement System Investment Commission. Our first order of business will be to adopt our proposed agenda. Everyone should have received a copy of the agenda. Do I have a motion to accept it as presented?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor of adopting the agenda as proposed?
Aye.
All opposed, like sign? Okay, we have an agenda. Very good. You also should have received a copy of the December 12th, 2024 minutes for that meeting. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to review those. If there are any suggested changes, I would entertain those now. Otherwise, do we have a motion to adopt?
Motion.
Okay, we have a motion. And a second. All in favor of adopting the minutes as presented, indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, like sign. Very good. We now have a adopted minutes. We'll turn our attention now to the chair's report. Anything to report, Mr. Chairman?
No, ma'am.
Okay. I don't believe we have any committee reports, but I could stand corrected if
I think we do have one.
Audit, yeah, audit met in the
Okay, I apologize. Okay.
audit met in the summary is posted, if, certainly
Okay.
entertain any questions, but,
Any questions on the audit report that's been posted? Okay, very good. So we're going to move on then to our actuarial update. Mr. Chairman, would you like to make the introductions?
yes, ma'am. The actuarial, we're going to now get an actuarial update from our systems actuaries, GRS. I believe we have Danny White and Joe Newton joining us via the Teams call. And this will be an update on the the July 1st, 2024 actuarial evaluation, so for fiscal year 2024. And I can turn it over to Danny and or Joe.
Thank you, Mike. Members of the board, hopefully everybody can hear us okay?
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
We're not able to see you, but if anybody has any questions, please, you're welcome to speak up during the presentation, and we'll address those as they may come. Mike, I think you gave a great introduction. I thank you for that. As he's mentioned, everything as of this presentation is as of July 1, 2024. We're 6 or 7 months past that and already given thoughts of 2025 val, but this gives you insight about the progress of the valuation, and we got projection information to show how things are gonna evolve. We'll go to the next slide on the agenda. Summary of historical demographics. You've got the underlying demographics of the plan. It's a driver of the liabilities to show you how those change. We got the 2024 valuation results, and then Joe will top it off and highlight projection information about really forward-looking information. I'm sure you all are very interested in hearing that as well. We go to the next slide. We got contributing membership and SCRS. So a few of the takeaways here is the overall contributing membership. There's different classes. You got working retirees in the yellow, state ORP, which is the DC plan. Even though they're in the DC plan, there is contributions going to SCRS to pay down the unfunded liability. So we consider them contributing membership to SCRS, even though they don't earn benefits in SCRS. And then we got class 2 and class 3 employees. Class 3 employees, very similar in benefits, a different vesting requirement, different eligibility for normal retirement, and different final average pay calculation. Otherwise, it's very, very similar benefits. One of the highlights there is the change made in Act in 2012 was prospective to new members. So that's where on the blue, where you see it expand, this is new members coming into the system after 2012. And then you can see on class 2 members who were in the plan, in the system prior to 2013, how those migrated as they terminate or are in the system. I think one thing to highlight, if there's a takeaway in perspectives, is if you ever did see legislation come through or future legislation, and I'm not just talking SCRS, but in the popular press, maybe it's another system to where they make a change and it's prospective. For an example, they close the system and go DC. It takes a long time to have an impact on the system for that. And it's not immediate effect, and you can see that through at least on the membership basis. It can make more on future contributions and funding strategy, but at least on demographics, it takes a while to work through. Look at the next slide. Members collecting benefits in SCRS. Just as we're counting noses here, and we'll have a next one on cash flow. But you can see how that's progressed over time, and these are actually fairly predictable because these are known members in the system. Both the current ones receiving benefits and future retirees. And so by just the mass of large numbers, this is a fairly predictable type demographic and of membership. We go to the next slide, let's talk about cash flow. So this is something more dear and here to RSIC. It's more interested in the payments coming in through contributions and the outflow in terms of benefit payments. And so a couple of things to note in here for any questions people may ask. You see on the benefit payments in blue, there's a spike in 2018. That was the cash out or close of Terry, the Terry program that was closed out June 30, 2018. And then you can also see on the contribution side, the contributions lagged in comparison to benefit payments really through 2018, and then you had the Reform Act, and that was that Mike and Peggy put a lot of effort in with the General Assembly to get passed in 2017. That ramped up the contribution rates to where they are right now, and you can see where you can. There's an increase in the contributions, and there's two reasons for it. One of them is the increase in the contribution rate itself as a percentage of pay, and then the second is as payroll increases, you're going to get additional revenue or contributions on that increased membership payroll. See, in 2024, you were actually on cash flow positive for SCRS. I think that's just it's. I don't want to call it coincidence, but it's, it just happened to be that way because of you had large increase in payroll and the increase in the contribution rate itself will show what the payroll experience was. Going forward, we expect that the plan to ultimately get back into a slightly negative external cash flow, but still on a manageable basis. All right, let's get into the valuation results. 2024. So next slide, please. What are the highlights? The first highlight, 10%, 10.5% market value for the prior year. We have a 5-year smoothing in the actuarial value of assets, so that doesn't directly flow through on the in reflecting of the unfunded liability, but it does through over time. And to kind of give you a perspective of what 1.2 billion and 0.2 billion mean for SCRS employers, that's about a half a year of employer contributions to the system. So it is material, and you think in just an isolation, that puts you ahead by 6 months in your anticipated funding. So that was on the asset side. On the liability side, there was an experience assumption conducted in 2024. Early 2024 was adopted by the June 2024. It added about 500 million in liability for SCRS, and there was a liability increase, a smaller amount for PORs. But the other notable experience that really had an effect. Active membership increased by 2.4% and covered payroll itself. So the revenue source that you're collecting contributions increased by 8% over the prior year for SCRS, and it was actually a bigger magnitude for PORs. So the increase was 3.9% in membership, and then payroll increased by 18%. And I've got some additional information on the payroll experience. So if you just hold off on questions on the payroll change, we're going to cover that in more detail. If we go to the slide for SCRS and PORs, the highlights there, you've got the liability minus the smooth value of assets, not the market. That's to take out the inherent short-term volatility. You have slight increase in the unfunded liability. Absent any changes, in asset liability experience or assumption changes, that unfunded liability would have gone down. But because of those liability losses, the salary experience, and the assumption change, we're going to see there was an increase. However, when we get in the projections, we're going to show that on the back end, that because of the nature of the experience and of those salary increases, it doesn't affect your funding period. And that because you get those additional contributions on the back end, see the calculated funding period itself actually went down. You would expect it to go down and actually went down by 2 for SCRS, and it went down by 3 for cores on a rounded basis. When we
Danny,
look
real quick, I think it's probably just, in following up on that, the amortization period, I think it's important to note that, as part of the 2017 pension reform legislation, the General Assembly set a schedule by which the unfunded liability had to come down, or the amortization period for the unfunded liability had to come down 1 year every year until it reached 20. And I believe for 2024, the requirement for both SCRS and PORS is 23 years. So that puts us 9 years ahead of schedule for SCRS and 10 years ahead of schedule for PORS, right?
Absolutely, yeah. When to reiterate, some of the board members may be newer. When the 2017 legislation was enacted, there was called a backstop or high water mark that in it that the funding period, or the maximum funding period, would walk down from 30 years to 20 and remain open, and that held kind of a minimum contribution effort standard. And what that was meant to do was to ensure that the contribution rates that were scheduled to be increased remained sufficient. And early on, there was there were a few years, and after that was effect, the margin or difference between the calculated funding period and what the maximum funding period was relatively close, and we're at a point now to where that gap has increased. And so the probability or likelihood that a minimum contribution rate would require an increase because of this funding period, it's really diminished over time, and I think is increasingly less likely to happen. If it does happen, there's a whole lot of other things that are going to go bad as well. And the last thing I'll note on expected contribution.
Danny, hold on. Sorry, Danny, hold on one thing. Ken Dean has a
I'm
question.
trying to kind of get clear in my head. Why would the actuarial accrued liability increase from for both plans from 2023 to 2024? I thought wouldn't it be going down?
Danny, I don't know if you could hear, but the question was, and I was the kind of the actual value of the unfunded liability went up for both SCRS and PORS. I think you touched on this maybe a little bit about the assumptions, the assumption changes and the experience changes that were resulting from the 2024 experience study, right?
That explains from 2023 to 2024. There was right. I'll go further than that. The report details how the liability increased and the sources of gains and losses. But if you go and look at the valuation report itself, you will see that almost without exception, the liability does continue to increase historically over the years. And I think Joe's got a projection slide on that to show historically what that was, but also projection. And the short answer is the liability increased from last year to this year, and it's expected to continue to increase in future years. And you can think of it, on the retirees, they get a benefit COLA. Which adds to benefit payments, although it's baked in. But you can think of also when we talk about pay, and we show how pay increased over the time. Well, your benefits are provided as a function of pay, and you can think of it. Hey, average salaries increased over the time period, so those nominal benefits are also going to increase. The average retiree benefit for somebody who had a career in SCRS. Today is going to have a larger average benefit than somebody who retired 10, 15 years ago, just because nominal pay or inflationary increases on a nominal basis are different. But we've got. Yes, sir.
Can I ask a follow-on on that? So are you saying that when we see these payroll increases, they first hit the liabilities and then get ameliorated over time by higher cash flows? Is that how we should think about it?
Yes. That's what I'm saying.
Yes, in the case of salary increases, yes, that you get the salary increase that's baked in first, which we anticipate future salary increases. So first of all, there's a level that's anticipated. And when you get something like what we experienced in FY24 that are bigger, it hits the liabilities immediately. And then you get the additional contributions on that higher payroll over time on the back end, and which impacts the cash flow and the calculated funding period.
Right, and that's why the funded ratio, even though the liability increased, that's why the funded ratio went up. Right, and the amortization period went down. Right, because
That's exactly why the
amelioration of those initial.
Yes. Yeah,
because of the amelioration of those. That's right. Yeah. Okay. Because of those additional cash flows that you're getting from the additional salary, that's above what you anticipated necessarily. Right.
Right.
Okay.
I've got a question. Are we now at the, per statute, are we now at the maximum employer contribution rate?
We are.
Absolutely.
Okay, so no more one.
And there,
You
couple
reached
years.
that. You reached that in FY 2024. So we are now at the maximum that was set in statute. That it was phased in over a 5-6 year period, and we've hit that phase in. You're correct, and you can note it in the bottom. You can see where the employer contributions from last year actual to what's expected this year. It's a slight increase, and what that is, that's an increase to expected payroll, but the contribution rate does not change. So we're at a point now to where employer contributions, the increase in the contributions are going to be much slower because we have reached that maximum anticipated contribution rate.
Danny,
Okay.
if you'll give me one more question, apologies. So a few slides ago, you talked about how even though we reached positive kind of net cash flows this past year, that you don't think that that's going to sustain. It's going to go back to slightly negative. Can you talk a little bit about what's going to cause that?
Well, yeah, if we go back to the 2 slides to where we showed the cash flow, we back up one more. So what's happened is you see the forward one more. We're at a point now to where we've reached that maximum contribution rate that was put in for FY 2024. So that was, that added over $100 million or so in contributions. But we're at a point now to where that since we've reached that maximum rate, any increase in dollar amount of contributions coming in is going to come in because your revenue source or your payroll is increasing. It's going to be due to the change in payroll and not due to a change in the contribution rate itself. Whereas on the benefit payments, you can see the trend and you can kind of extrapolate mentally in your mind over the short term how you see where benefit payments continue to go up, and we expect that to continue in the future. I mean, the model shows that. I mean, this is what a model shows. But
Thank you.
yep, okay, all right. So now we go to the next slide. We covered everything here. This is for the people who are very numerically inclined. If you're graphically inclined, I apologize, but we've got all the numbers to show you just how we look at and kind of analyze, break down the experience to try to understand what's going on. To us, how we look at it is based on different service levels. And what we're finding is the actual increase, versus expected tend to be higher across the board. And it'll be more pronounced with fours, but that's, it's just not a certain group, although you can see it higher for the younger service members. The other thing to note is when you look at the relative count, there's very few people that are active members, beyond 30 years of service and fours. especially when you compare it to the number of tier 3 members or class 3 members who have less than 10 years of service. The other one, we also look at it based on the different, employment groups, whether you're a public school employee, state employee, or local government or other agency, and to see if there's certain areas that had different experience, even though you're all in one combined risk pool. To give you a notion, it wasn't uncommon to see public school employees get an increase earlier on compared to state and other agencies in prior years because of the need and such. But you'll see now where state employees and local governments are also giving similar type increases. So this last year was not just a phenomenon or an experience to just a certain group. It's relatively all SCRS members. Just the other thing to note, I think it was a question that came up last year, and I anticipate to come up again this year. Of the total payroll increase during last year was about 900 million, and about 850 of that was just due to pay increases for current members for SCRS. A little different for PORs, but of that total payroll increase, it was really not. It was more due to the raises for continuing active rather than the increase in active membership. We go to the next slide. We got the same information for PORs. There's no public school employees for in PORs, earning benefits in PORs, but we just have state and local government. And you can see here's an example where the difference is slightly different for state employees versus local government, that there were higher increases across the board. Probably a catch up in the merit portion for state employees, where you see it happens with the higher actual increases. And again, the counts let you know on a relative basis, while that's true for state, there's about twice as many PORS members that are employed by other agencies rather than state. And then you see the combined effect. As I note there, the total increase in payroll for PORs was about 300 million. About 170 million was due to pay increases for current employees, and you had about 130 million just due to new active members coming in. We talked about the number of active membership increasing quite a bit more for PORs and SCRS, and that shows through in the change in the payroll counter. The explanation of the change in the payroll count from last year to this year. All right, if we go to the next slide, we got the summary of benefits for the 3 smaller systems maintained by PIBA. JSRS is for Judicial Retirement System, GARS is the General Assembly Retirement System, and then the SCNG is the South Carolina National Guard Supplemental Plan. I think Mike can explain to you. I think he's a member in there. Provides a supplemental retirement benefit on 20 years of service. There was a question about the change in liability for SCRS about going up. One thing I'll call out to note is if we look at GARS, where the liability actually went down, that is a closed plan. It was closed to all General Assembly members who become General Assembly members after 2012. So they earn benefits in SCRS. And so they closed the plan. So there you have more benefits being paid out faster than being earned. So the liability there is actually going down and projected to continue to decrease because there are no new members going in. National Guard, small change. It's a very supplemental benefit. And again, it goes to benefits being paid out versus benefits earned. And then you have the judicial plan, and the liability of that is expected to continue to increase as new judges continue to earn benefits in that system.
Danny,
One question, when we see like the increase in liability for both, for the systems or the liabilities increase, I think SCRS, judicial and PORS, way that I would think about it is once you're past that point of neutrality, which is the 20 years on the amortization period, right? The increase in liability, as long as you're, hitting the assumed rate of return, right? The increase in liability would come from other experience, right? Not necessarily, because like when you hit that point of neutrality, you're covering, in essence, the interest cost on the unfunded liability, right?
The contributions are, the contributions.
Yeah, that's right.
When you get a 20-year funding period, the idea is that you're in a point of positive amortization where you would expect the contributions to pay down the unfunded exceed the interest on the unfunded.
Right.
And you would expect a decrease in the unfunded liability. And we've got projection information to kind of show that Joe's going to cover very shortly.
Cool. All right. Well, there you go. All right. Next slide.
Joe?
Great. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. We're going to switch over a little bit. We're looking forward on some of this information, maybe revisit a couple of the items we just talked about. But this is for SCRS. The red line represents the liabilities of the system. In the blue and or green and blue down here are the asset values. The solid, when they're solid, we're actually showing you the history. So you can see the first 10 years or so on here is actual history. So the red line has grown from 40 billion up to just above 60 billion over 2024. And the assets were kind of flat coming out of the Great Recession. This was one of the reasons we needed the contribution rate increase. It's been phased in. Now that it's reached the top of the contribution schedule, we now expect the assets to be able to begin to catch those liabilities. So a couple of points here. Yes, it's true. The liabilities, we do expect them to grow. And you can see that happening here. It could be about the pace of wage inflation over time, so 3% a year. And really that's because every cohort of member is going to have a little bit higher benefit than the previous one. So every 10 years, think about people retiring 10 years from now, they should have higher benefits on average because their pay increases over the next 10 years. And then the idea is not to have a zero liability. The idea is to make sure that all your liabilities are secured by assets in the trust. And you can see that that's the plan. And so when we say there's a 14-year funding period, we're saying it's going to take 14 years for those assets to catch. I think an intuitive question would be, well, wait a minute, why, if we look at the left side here, the assets haven't been catching. Why should we now anticipate that they will begin to catch? And it really has to do with this cash flow we've been talking about. You go back to 2016, 2017, 2018, the negative cash flow was -4%, -5%. And so what that meant for every if you have a 7% return assumption, so for every $100 in there, you're earning $7 of earnings. Well, if you're turning around and paying $5 of that out in net cash flow, it makes it really hard to accumulate assets. Well, now, as Danny said, this year it was actually positive cash flow. Even going forward, we don't expect the negative cash flow to be more than 1% paid out. And so what that means is for every for the earnings you get to keep 6 of it. And then that starts to compound on itself. And that's really the strategy and why it's anticipated this asset value to catch this liability in around that 14-year time. Next slide. This is a history of the unfunded liability. And for the funding period to be 14, that means the unfunded liability has to go to 0. Well, logically, for the unfunded liability to go to 0, it has to start going down at some point. Like it can't keep going. It can't keep going up. Yeah. Well, it's one of those things. So if you look back at the impact statement in 2016, when we were putting together the contribution strategy, we anticipated 2024, this year's val, would have been the first time the unfunded liability actually went down. Because of the ramp up in the contributions and just where everything was in the strategy and the time frame, the unfunded liability, you can see it grew slower, right? I mean, the pace these last few years has been slower than it was. Didn't expect the unfunded liability to start going down till 2024. So this was a little bit of a disappointment to Danny and myself this year. And it really had to do with those salary increases. If you look at just the amortization strategy that's in place, we expected about $715 million of principal pay down, meaning if you look at how much interest was accrued and how much contributions was put towards that, there was an extra $715 million this year that should have paid the unfunded liability down. And so we should have seen the unfunded liability go down. Well, the salary loss was $750 million. So the salary impact outweighed that enough to keep the unfunded liability going down. This year, 2025, again, it's around $800 million or so that we expect it to go down. So it's going to take another significant loss from salaries or investments for it to not go down. But investments, we have $900 million of deferred gains in the bank. I'm not sure where you're at mid-year, but it doesn't feel like a big negative year. So again, I think our probabilities of 2025 being that first time the unfunded liability turns over, starts to go down, we start to see real tangible evidence that the funding strategy is working, and then should just continue from there. If we go to the next slide, this is what, like, how the unfunded liability be paid off. The light blue is last year's projection where we thought the unfunded liability, would be at every point in time going forward. The dark blue is this year's, and so you can see up front, it actually came in ahead. We had those losses. The unfunded liability was bigger this year than we expected. But because of those pay increases and because of membership growth is the best fuel on the fire for a pension plan. We expect to get more contributions in the future, and you can see the dark blue line actually amortizes itself to zero the dark blue bars before the light blue bars. So even though we're back, we're actually expect to run a little faster and get there a little sooner. The lines are the funded ratios, which you can see are basically just the inverse of that unfunded liability.
Joe, you mind if I make a quick comment?
Sure.
Thank you. I want to just convey something just for completeness that you have the contribution rate is the fixed amount on the contributions. And so under that strategy, the ultimate date you reach your unfunded liability is more of a variable. It's going to be dependent on experience. That's the flip side from where you have a funding plan to where the known date that you're fully funded is known, but then your contributions will adjust up and down to fit that date, to meet that target date. And if you talk to employers, they much rather prefer this type of funding model versus the latter because they can more easily budget in terms of what their costs are going to be, because this contribution rate is fixed and known, and they can plan for it. So that just try to understand that in the back when you see these types of graphs and how things change from last year to this year. Thank you, Joe.
All right. Next slide gives a little bit of a stress test here. It's a pretty extreme stress test now, but we've kept it because this was the scenario that was used back in 2016, 2017, when the current contribution schedule was put in place. It was done on just an amazing way, really, which was to build it based on a stress test scenario. So instead of just assuming assumptions are met, we're going to put the contribution strategy in place, assuming stress, and to make sure that we've got room for adverse experience and a high probability of success. And so we've kept that kind of same stress test even now. So the red dotted line, let's just talk about what you have here. This is the employer contribution rate. The dark blue line at the top is the 1856 that actually is going in. The green line is what would the valuation to get that 23-year requirement that's in statute, what could the contribution rate be? So you can see it's around 14% is all that's needed to hit a 23-year funding period. So that's the minimum, right? So the red dots are, okay, based on the minimum, the statutory minimum, the red dots or the green would need to go up and exceed the blue line before contribution increases would be necessary. So the red line is a stress test that says, okay, what if the fund earns 4% for the next 5 years and then earns 7 after that? And so you can see the contribution rate based on the statutory minimum doesn't even really increase from where we are now. It basically stays flat and then turns over and basically starts going down. So basically what that's telling us is the gap between the contributions we're getting and the minimum contributions needed to meet the minimum statutory requirement is growing and just forming in a lot of cushion that the current funding strategy will work. We have to the next slide. Here's some other trying to back into what would it take to actually make it not work. So going to the top, if SBRS earns 0% over the decade, we would eventually hit it in 2037. Even a 2% return, we don't actually, through 2053 at least, expect that contribution rate increase would be required. So again, there's a lot of cushion there. But looking at the other side, some good times, right? What would it take to get fully funded faster? Because once we reach fully funded, the 1856 can come down to something less and try to provide some relief. Well, if you get 10% returns over the next decade, you can see 2033 is when that would occur. If you get 8% returns, 2036. So that's kind of we'll call that, good outcome range. You can see somewhere between 2033 and 2036. Finally, for SCRS, on the next slide, do some probability of outcomes. Because again, we're showing you lots of lines, lots of straight lines. We know that's not quite how this works. So looking at ranges, and just like all the other actuarial metrics, it's actually the trend that is more important than the individual spot, because a different practitioner or even your own investment group could come up with a little bit different assumptions, and so your probabilities might change a little bit. But what should be happening over time is that the trend, like the improvement in the given metric, should be consistent. This year, a couple of the items, we get a little bit of a hiccup, but that's mainly due to the assumption changes that were put in place, especially the biggest one was retirement patterns for teachers. Teacher retirements have been well ahead of what was expected in the past, so we made an adjustment there. So that pulled back a little bit on the probabilities. But these are just some general questions. What's the probability we're greater than 85% funded in 2035? You can see that there's been quite a bit of improvement there. In 2022, we thought there was only about a 39% chance of being there. Now, about a 55% chance of being there by 2035. The unfunded liability is smaller than it is now in 5 years, has increased up to 71% chance that that's likely. And then the last one, what's the probability that we do exceed the 1856? So basically, what's the probability that at some point SCRS, people would have to go to the legislature and ask for more contributions? Is basically what that last question is. You can see in 2022, there's about a 22% chance, we'll call it 1 in 5. Last year, 8%, so 1 in 10. This year, ticked up a little bit, but it's still in that 1 in 10 range. And again, that the entire difference really was the new assumptions are a little bit more conservative.
Joe, on that probability assumption for the increase, that's not constrained to a particular time period there. That's not like,
no, we're saying
at any point, right? That it would have to.
Yeah, and it doesn't even mean like a fail here is actually pretty. It's easy to fail. Basically, if you tick above it one time and then immediately go back below it, then we'd still consider that a fail. So, it's very low probabilities. We're going to need more than 1856. Okay. So going on to PORs, it's a very similar message and graphs and everything. In this case, they did have a little bit bigger salary increases. They're a little bit more leveraged, so they get a little bit wider outcomes. But generally, you can see here, this slide looks very similar to the same slide that occurred for SCRS. In fact, it's the same at the endpoints. 2024 came in a little bit worse than expected, but we get fully funded 1 year sooner than previous years. So last slide, just to wrap up, the the unfunded liability dollar amount, we do project that to begin to decrease this next year. We'll see what the actual experience comes in, but there's just beginning to be very heavy pressure for that to begin to decline. It's very unlikely that it's highly likely that the current contribution rates will satisfy the statutes going forward. Very unlikely that we'll have to ask for more contributions. However, if we get adverse experience, what that means is that they'll have to pay those contributions longer, right? So there's no free lunch. It's just unlikely that it's going to have to go up above the current rates. And so our recommendation, as it's been for a while now, is just stay the course. We think that the current strategy has high probability of success, and it needs time to do that. So are there any further questions or?
I think one of the things that, we'll be interested in and having, conversations with both you guys and with FIBA, and, I've expressed this to Peggy as well, is to start thinking about the glide path, whenever we can hit that 85% and when contribution rates would be able to start coming down. So I think that's, I think those are some some advanced planning on that, I think is key for us, given because that obviously the net negative cash flow situation is a lot better, but to the extent that increases kind of beyond due to contribution rates coming down, that's something that we would need some advanced planning for. So we look forward to talking to you guys about that and FIBA as well, which, thankfully that's a success. That's a success problem. So
it is a success problem. And I think that once the unfunded liability is starting to come down, it's going to be easier to have that conversation with somebody.
That makes sense.
But also, that the cliff, if it was to just go from 1856 down to say 5% overnight, I mean, that would be a pretty abrupt change to your negative cash flow. So I agree. It would be better to start a little earlier and have a little bit more of a transition going on.
That's right. Yeah, we're much more interested, regardless, I think wherever you start bringing it down, we're much more interested in a transition than necessarily we are certainly an abrupt change in that would cause us difficulties when managing the plan. So,
you don't want to cause trauma to the asset pool.
That's right. Yeah. You don't want to, we don't want to need that.
That doesn't help.
That's right.
But we also need to consider the distributional effect in terms of which employers are paying the higher rate and how it should be shared across employers over time. That's another consideration in reducing the contribution gradually rather than jumping off a cliff.
Sure.
It does seem like, and it kind of goes along with what our CEO was just talking about, now that we're at the maximum contribution level, now that SCRS unfunded liability is going to start going down, it's almost like we're at a reset period, or maybe a different stage, maybe not a reset, but a different stage, start thinking about how that affects us. And Mike talked about a glide on rates in the future. I've mentioned it before. Should that affect our investment outlook? But it does seem kind of like we're kind of at a different stage of planning or new variables or new thoughts. We probably need to add in now.
Yeah. I mean, we're
over time, not tomorrow. But
yeah, that's why we want to try to have as much, look through and see how as much in advance as, because it can affect how we think about the portfolio. So we want to make sure that that's something that we have plenty of time to anticipate and make any necessary changes. I think that's why I think it's important for all of us, us, the actuaries, to get together and start having those conversations now rather than later. Because there's a lot of variance in when that could actually happen. That could happen if times are good. That could happen pretty quickly. So, anyway.
That was a good presentation.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Do we have any other questions for our actuarial consultants before they leave us? Okay, thank you very much,
Thank you.
Danny and Joe.
Thank you.
We'll turn next to our delegated investment report. Our Chief Investment Officer, Mr. Berg.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So as is always the case, we do show you, remind you, frankly, of the investments that closed since our prior meeting. You have received information about these. These are two private equity investments. One is a firm based in Charlotte that we're very, very thrilled to be investing alongside, and the other is a venture platform that we are real excited about. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to have Brian Moore answer them.
Have we used these funds before?
Bandana is a new platform for us to help us.
Where they are located?
That is a great question. Where are they located? They have a number. They have partners dispersed across the country. But we have invested with Fall Furious before, right? It's a second fund investment, I believe. But the Sandana relationship is one that we're really excited about. As well.
Okay.
Madam Chair, the next item is would be a motion to proceed into executive session to discuss investment matters and certain portions of the consolidated annual investment plan and statement of investment objectives and policies pursuant to SC Code Section 9-16-80 and 9-16-320, including a discussion of the bonds portfolio, to discuss personnel matters and to receive advice from legal counsel pursuant to SC Code annotated Section 30-4-70A1, subsections 1 through 2.
So here a motion.
Motion? Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor of moving into executive session, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, like sign. Hearing none, we will move into executive session now and ask our staff to take the appropriate.
No action was taken in executive session, either reportable or non-reportable.
Did you just take that or?
That goes down. Okay. So, and otherwise, our business is completed, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Entertain a motion.
Well, yes, so I hear a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All right, all in favor of adjournment, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Even there'd be none.
Very low. Yeah, that's right.
Wow.